The Second Battle of Ypres, Part 4, Frezenberg and Bellewaerde. The Battle of Frezenberg, May 8th to 13th, 1915. The Germans moved field artillery forward, placing 3 Army Corps opposite the 27th and 28th Divisions on the Fresenberg Ridge. Here's the 27th Division and the 28th Division. The German attack began on May 8th with a bombardment of the 83rd Brigade in trenches on the forward slope of the ridge. But the 1st and 2nd infantry assaults were repelled by the survivors. However, the 3rd German assault of the morning pushed the defenders back. Although the neighboring 80th Brigade repulsed the attack, the 84th Brigade was pushed back. This left a 2-mile, 3.2-kilometer gap in the line. The Germans were prevented from advancing further by Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the PPCLI, and the British counterattack. The 10th Brigade moved up during the night as well. The PPCLI was the first Canadian unit to be ready and sent to fight in the First World War. They were privately raised by the wealthy Hamilton Gault and were comprised of mostly veterans from the South Africa War. Their numbers were increased upon their formation with university graduates and students. They were attached to the British 27th Division's 80th Brigade. The battle honour is formally entitled the Battle of Fresenberg Ridge, and itself being part of the Battles of Ypres, 1915. The honour, Fresenberg, was awarded to 66 British units and 1 Canadian battalion, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, for their defence of positions preventing a German attack from gaining the ground east of Ypres. Following the battles of St. Julien, the British Expeditionary Force in the Ypres salient withdrew on May 3rd to May 4th to better positions defending Ypres. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, PPCLI, part of the 27th British Division's 80th Brigade, moved to positions along Bellewaerde Ridge, a few hundred meters west of Frezenberg. On May 8th, a violent German bombardment launched a German attack between Mousetrap Farm, just north of Welchie, and Frezenberg. 6 German divisions attacked the 27th Division and the 28th on its left. The Patricias held the far left flank of the 27th Division and were closest to the heaviest portion of the German attack that fell on the 28th Division in front of Frezenberg. The 28th Division successfully repulsed 2 German assaults before the 3rd assault overwhelmed its defenses. The PPCLI commemoration goes as follows, according to Master Warrant Officer, Master Gunner Mark Adkins, and Regimental History. At the time of the battle, the PPCLI, which was only 1 battalion in World War I, were not part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, CEF, but instead part of the British Expeditionary Force in the 80th Brigade, 27th Division. This luckily meant that they were equipped with Lee Enfield rifles instead of the Ross rifles that the CEF were using. On May 5th, 1915, the regiment had lost its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Buller, who was injured by artillery. However, Major Gault, the founder, had recovered from his previous injuries and took command of the unit. So, on May 6th, with only 14 officers and less than 600 men, they did a relief in place with the 2nd Battalion Shropshire's Light Infantry, a British unit, on Bellewaerde Ridge. On May 7th, they were under persistent and accurate German artillery fire and suffered 17 casualties. They conducted an intercompany relief in place on the night of May 7th, so the unit was laid out with number 1 and number 2 companies forward and number 3 and number 4 companies in depth in the support trenches. And the King's Royal Rifles were on the right flank of the unit. The 8th of May found the PPCLI coming under artillery fire at around 4 a.m. It became severe by 5:30 a.m., including gas shells. They spotted Germans coming down the slopes of the hill near West Hooge and greeted them with rifle fire. By 6 a.m., all telephone wires had been cut. The German artillery was joined just after dawn by heavy guns, joining around 0700 hours, and they also came under enfilading machine gun fire from the right flank. The heavy enemy shelling by field guns and howitzers blew most of the right-hand trench in. Major Hamilton Galt, DSO, was wounded a 2nd time, being hit in the left arm and severely in the left thigh. He laid there for more than 10 hours as the battle raged around him. By 0800, Major Galt was able to send a message to brigade by runner advising them that the unit was down to 160 men in the forward trenches and down to only 2 MGs. It was just after 0800 that the Germans made their initial assault on the position. The forward trenches were able to break the assault, but unfortunately 2 or 3 enemy MG crews managed to establish positions from which they could engage the support trenches. Around 0900 hours, the main assault by the Germans managed to occupy portions of the right-hand front trench line and were using flags to mark the forward edge of the trench clearance. This is a drill that we use today. This allowed the German guns to adjust their fire and concentrate on the support trenches. Major Galt and 4 other officers were taken out of action, and Captain Edgar Adamson, fondly known as Akety Ak to the soldiers, took over command of the unit, accompanied by RSM Fraser. They moved among the men, encouraging them and directing their efforts to hold. Adamson was hit in the shoulder by shrapnel. He moved with the use of one arm for as long as he could. One Patricia wrote, "I recall seeing Captain Adamson with an arm hanging down, getting ammunition from the dead and dying, and giving it to us. The front line had gone, so we moved up the support trench to enter the front line farther on, but this could not be accomplished. Our rifles got so hot we had to change rifles to keep up the fire." By 1000 hours, the situation was dire. Out of ammunition and in danger of being completely overrun, the front line was more or less abandoned, and the unit suffered about 75% casualties. They were reinforced by a company of the Rifle Brigade. From about 1000 hours until 1400 hours was just pure chaos, with heavy German fire being brought down on them with multiple attacks repelled. There were numerous examples of extreme bravery and dedication. These included actions from the acting CO, Captain Adamson, who continued commanding while wounded, RSM Fraser, killed distributing ammunition and directing fire, Corporal Bowler, collecting medical supplies while under fire, Corporal Mackenzie, a runner, carrying messages to brigade headquarters and guiding in new troops, are just a few. Around 1700 hours, the pressure was left off the unit, as the Germans had to deal with the division's counterattack. By nightfall, with the darkness, it was safe enough to evacuate the wounded, and the wounded Captain Adamson handed over command to Lieutenant Niven, whose gallantry and coolness during the battle had been conspicuous. Once the wounded were evacuated, and those deceased which they could safely be got to were buried, Lieutenant Niven withdrew the unit. Its strength at the end of the battle was 4 officers and 150 men, which is roughly one modern-day infantry company. Most of the missing were eventually declared as presumed dead, but 17 men were taken prisoner and kept alive. This implies, with the kept alive part, that many more were taken prisoner, but were killed at some point after having surrendered. Such was the reality of the Great War, and Canadians sometimes did this too. Today, this battle is regarded as the death of the originals, and, while in the grand scheme of the First World War may be insignificant to the regiment, it is a historic day and formed part of the ethos of the regiment. The 2 major takeaways of the battle that were used and helped to win were concept of ops, which they may not have called it such back then, but it meant that everyone knew their commander's intent, so when commanders were wounded or killed, the next man stepped up, and seek and accept responsibility. The officers and men stepped up to fill the role of being in command when needed. The initial German barrage that opened the attack caused several casualties among the Patricias, wiping out several of their machine gun positions. The battalion called forward all of its men, including orderlies, batmen, and signalers, to help with the defense. The Patricias' open left flank faced a German assault that was trying to roll up the flank of the division. They fought back repeated German assaults on their positions with rifle fire until, having suffered almost 400 casualties during that day's fighting, reinforcements from the reserve battalions of the 80th and 81st Brigades arrived in late afternoon. When fully relieved just before midnight on the same day, their strength was down to 4 officers and 150 men, who were no longer in shape to fight, from a previous strength of about 700. In the regimental history, this battle was referred to also as the death of the originals. After this, their unofficial motto, "Holding up the whole damn line," is still used today. The battles of Bellewaerde, Hooge. There were actually several battles for Bellewaerde, beginning in 1914. Hooge was a small village on top of Bellewaerde Ridge. Bellewaerde refers to the area around it, and Bellewaerde Lake was behind the chateau, which was on the north side of the Menin Road, which had a separate annex standing in its own grounds by a large wood. There were also a racehorse stables east of the village that were at the very apex of the salient. The stables were actually part of the front line. For much of the war, Hooge was one of the easternmost sectors of the Ypres salient, being almost constantly exposed to enemy attacks from 3 sides. After the First Battle of Ypres in 1914, the front line of the salient ran through the Hooge area, and there was almost constant fighting in the region over the next 3 years, during which Hooge and the Chateau de Hooge, a local manor house, were destroyed. Around the village, the opposing front lines were almost within whispering distance of each other, with its ruined village and a maze of battered and confusing trench lines. The area was regarded as a hazardous area for the infantry, where snipers abounded and trench raids were frequent. Both sides saw Hooge as a particularly important area and a key target for heavy artillery bombardment. Possession of Bellewaerde Ridge, which is the higher ground to the south and east of Ypres, gives great ground observation of Ypres itself. It is great for enfilade fire by machine guns and converging artillery bombardments. An occupier also has the advantage that artillery deployments and the movement of reinforcements, supplies, and stores can be screened from view. The ridge had woods from Whitescheit to Zonnebeek, giving good cover, some being of notable size, like Polygon Wood, and those later named Battlewood, Shrewsbury Forest, and Sanctuary Wood. In 1914, the woods usually had undergrowth, but by 1917, artillery bombardments had reduced the woods to tree stumps, shattered tree trunks, and barbed wire tangled on the ground, and shell holes. The fields in gaps between the woods were 800 to 1,000 yards, 730 to 910 meters wide, and devoid of cover. Roads in this area were usually unpaved, except for the main ones from Ypres, with occasional villages and houses. The lowland west of the ridge was a mixture of meadow and fields, with high hedgerows dotted with trees, cut by streams and ditches, emptying into canals. The main road to Ypres from Poperinge to Vlamertinge is a defile, easily observed from the ridge. Military operations. The Battle of Gelleveld. During the First Battle of Ypres, by October 28th, as the German Fourth Army attacks bogged down, Falkenhayn responded to the costly fares of the Fourth and Sixth Armies by ordering the armies to conduct holding attacks, while a new force, Army Group Fabeck, under the command of General Max von Fabeck, was assembled from 15 Corps and 2nd Bavarian Corps. These units were the 26th Division and the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division under the 13th Corps headquarters. The Army Group was rushed up to Douaumont and Wervik, which was the boundary between the 6th and 4th Armies, to attack towards Ypres and Poperinge. Strict economies were imposed on the 6th Army formations further south to provide artillery ammunition for 250 heavy guns allotted to attack to the northwest between Gelleveld and Messines. The 15th Corps was to attack on the right flank south of the Menin-Ypres road to the Comines-Ypres Canal, and the main effort was to come from there to Gare Dieu by the 2nd Bavaria Corps, flanked by the 26th Division. On October 29th, attacks by the 27th Reserve Corps began against British 1st Corps north of the Menin Road at dawn in thick fog. By nightfall, the Bellewaerde crossroads had been lost, and 600 British prisoners taken. French attacks further north by the French 17th Division, 18th Division, and 31st Division recaptured Bixschoote and Courteclear Cabaret. Advances by Army Group Fabec to the southwest against 1st Corps and the dismounted Cavalry Corps further south came to within 1.9 miles or 3 kilometers of Ypres along the Menin Road and brought the town into range of German artillery. On October 30th, German attacks by the 54th Reserve Division and the 30th Division on the left flank of the BAEF at Bellewaerde were repulsed, but the British were pushed out of Zandvoorde, Hollebeek, and Hollebeek Chateau. As German attacks on a line from Messines to Whitescheit and St. Ives were repulsed. The British rallied opposite Zandvoorde with French reinforcements and Bulfin's force, a command improvised for the motley group of troops. The BEF had many casualties and used all its reserves, but the French 9th Corps sent its last 3 battalions and retrieved the situation in the 1st Corps sector. On October 31st, German attacks near Bellewaerde broke through until a counterattack by the 2nd Worcestershire Battalion restored the situation. An important British tactic was the Mad Minute. British troops held their fire until the German troops were in fairly close range and nearly point blank before opening fire and pouring accurate fire into the enemy troops as fast as the British troops could reload and re-aim. This gave a wall of fire that was nearly impossible to pass through, causing the German attacks to nearly always fail. This also saved on ammunition, as not as much was wasted, and the attacks were over fairly quickly. In 1914, during the First Battle of Ypres, from October 19th to November 22nd, 1914, the Franco-British forces occupied the town of Ypres and held it from capture by the Germans. The Chateau de Hooge was used by the commanders of the 1st and 2nd Divisions for their divisional headquarters. When the chateau was shelled by German forces on October 31st, 1914, the divisional commanders, Lieutenant General S. H. Lomax and Major General Charles Munro, were injured, as well as several members of their staffs. Some British soldiers were killed, and Lomax died of his wounds several months later. By the end of the battle in November, the Germans had been driven back, but the front line of the Ypres salient ran around Hooge. Here are greater details of the events in 1914. It was referred to as the disaster at Hooge. One of the most frequently heard misconceptions about the First World War is that the British and Commonwealth generals and their staff officers shared neither the hardships nor the dangers of the average front-line soldier. The book, Bloody Red Tabs, by Frank Davies and Graham Maddox, had been an important rebuttal of these arguments, detailing 78 generals who were killed in action or died of wounds. The book also provides biographies of a further 146 generals who were wounded or became prisoners of war. Still, the lions led by donkeys narrative prevails today. Perhaps the worst single incident of the First World War in terms of the near destruction of command and control of British divisions was during the First Battle of Ypres. At This stage in the war, the Germans were pressing the British and Commonwealth troops back, and it was felt that a breakthrough by the Germans was possible. Had this occurred, the way would have been open to the Channel ports. This would have been a disaster for the Allies. With this happening, the commanders of the British 1st and 2nd Divisions, Lieutenant General Sir Samuel Lomax and Major General Sir Charles Munro, had requisitioned in October the Chateau de Hooge, just outside Ypres, as a suitable place for their headquarters. The chateau was only 2 miles from the front line. By lunchtime on October 31st, it was becoming clear that the British front line had been broken in 1 or 2 places, and immediate action was needed to stabilize the situation. Lieutenant Colonel, at the time, Ernest Swinton, wrote in his book Eyewitness, "As I drove away, I turned around to look at the Chateau of Hooge, standing a little to the north of the road. The approach was packed with cars. A splendid advertisement to catch the eye of any chance enemy airmen who happened to wander above and proclaim that here was a British headquarters. It may not have been necessary for the cars to be spotted by aerial reconnaissance, because the Germans had control of the ridges to the east, and the concentration of cars must have caught their attention. A German airplane flew over the chateau, but this failed to alert the staff of the headquarters to possible danger, and work continued in a room overlooking the gardens. At about 1:30 p.m., the first shell fell in the chateau gardens. Many of the occupants of the room rushed to the French windows which opened onto the gardens. It seems that the danger of the situation still did not occur to those present. Major General Munro, however, took advantage of the distraction to consult with his GSO-1, Chief of Staff, Colonel Robert Wigham, in a doorway to the adjoining studio. This act probably saved both of their lives, as a second shell burst close to the French windows. The metal and glass tore through the room, causing massive casualties. A third shell hit the chateau, causing damage, but no more injuries. Some reports say that a fourth shell also hit the chateau. In the moments after the shelling, the high number of casualties was obvious. Lieutenant General Lomax was critically injured and was evacuated to a casualty clearing station. Major General Munro had a severe concussion, but was otherwise unhurt. Besides the critical wounding of Lieutenant General Lomax, his Chief of Staff, Colonel F.W. Kerr, was also killed, as well as the most senior staff officer of the division, Major George Paley. Lieutenant General Lomax was evacuated back to the UK, but was to die of his injuries 6 months later. He was one of the most senior general officers to be killed in the Great War. The 2nd Division staff was also badly affected. Colonel Wigham was knocked unconscious, but was okay. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Percival, GSO-2 of the 2nd Division, was killed, as well as a captain and a major of artillery. The Royal Engineers commander was wounded, as well as 2 of his officers. 2 other artillery officers were seriously wounded and died of their wounds. Prince Maurice of Battenberg, a grandson of Queen Victoria, was a junior officer who was killed when he was hit by shrapnel while leading a platoon of his men of the King's Royal Rifle Corps across a road near the Broodsind Ridge. He died at the dressing station at Zonnebeek. He was buried with his fellow troops, including those who died at Hooge. The King's Royal Rifle Corps Battalion lost 5 other officers and 167 other ranks on October 27th. Hooge in 1915. From the spring of 1915, there was constant underground fighting in the Ypres salient at Hooge, Hill 60, Railway Wood, Sanctuary Wood, St. Eloi, and the Bluff. These actions required the deployment of new drafts of tunnelers for several months after the formation of the first 8 tunneling companies of the Royal Engineers. On December 29, 1914, the French blew the first mine under the German trenches at Zwarteline, near Hill 60. The French blew another mine in the same area on January 27th. On February 21, 1915, the Germans exploded the first mine beneath the British trenches at Hooge. On July 19, 1915, the British 175th Tunneling Company blew a massive mine that made the huge crater near Hooge, which is now the site of a museum and a war cemetery. The 173rd Tunneling Company completed and blew 5 more mines on Hill 60 on April 17th, but the Hooge crater was much larger. During the Second Battle of Ypres, the British were forced to retreat from the Zonnebeek, Veldhoek, and St. Julien Arc on May 5th to 6th, 1915, to a surveyed and prepared position closer to Ypres from May 24th to May 25th. The official First Battle of Bellewaerde was fought in the area until the end of the German offensive for May. The First Battle of Bellewaerde, May 24th to 25th, 1915. On May 24th at 02:45 hours, a ferocious German artillery bombardment slammed down on the British First Corps front. This attack was made against the 27th and 28th Divisions. The clamor of shells, machine guns, and rifle fire was accompanied by a simultaneous discharge of chlorine gas on almost the entire length of the shell trap farm area. Regular artillery and machine gun fire on the Bluff, Ypres, and the March 1915 British line was also heavy. This is from the official history of the 2nd Royal Dublin Fusiliers, following their return to the trenches on May 19th. This was after being withdrawn from the line after being badly shelled during the Battle of Frezenberg on May 9th. The war diary described May 9th as one of the worst days shelling the battalion experienced. They were pulled out of the line to recover and receive replacements at Vlamertinghe Chateau. After returning to the trenches, the war diary records little of interest in the following few days, other than intermittent shelling and sniping. The entry for May 23rd records a quiet day and night. The Dubliners were not to know it, but that quiet night was the calm before the storm. Shell Trap Farm, May 24th, 1915, gas attack. The First Battle of Bellewaerde Ridge. At 2:45 a.m. on May 24th, the enemy attacked with gas. The area around Shell Trap Farm and to its immediate northwest was most affected. The area around Bellewaerde Lake was also attacked. A detailed report of the events of May 24, 1915, by Captain Thomas J. Leahy, incorrectly transcribed as Linky in the report, is attached to the battalion war diary. Leahy describes that their CO, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Loveband, had suspected gas may be used when inspecting the trenches at Shelltrap Farm earlier that night. He had personally warned all company officers to be prepared, whilst Major Russell, Royal Army Medical Corps, had inspected all their Vermorel sprayers, which was a container with a hose and nozzle used to dissipate gas, and warned each company about damping their respirators. Leahy's report notes there were 10 sprayers in working order that night, one with each machine gun, and the remainder distributed along the trenches. When seeing red lights thrown up from the German trenches, a signal for gas release, Lieutenant Colonel Loveband shouted, "Get your respirators, boys! Here comes the gas!" Leahy notes how little time they had. We had only just time to get our respirators on before the gas was over us. There was a gentle breeze. The gas cloud, being very dense, took about 3/4 of an hour to pass over the Fusiliers' position. German parties advanced in small numbers at 4:30 a.m., occupying the British line north and to the left of the battalion's trenches. With these trenches occupied, the battalion was now subjected to enfilade fire. Under heavy shell fire, and aided by part of 2 companies of the 9th Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the battalion held their trenches to the end. The report makes harrowing reading, containing transcripts of signals sent by isolated parties within the farm complex. Even after more than 100 years after the event, it is clear to sense the fear in 2nd Lieutenant Robert Kempston from B Company's message, which simply stated, "For God's sake, send us some help. We are nearly done." Kempston was killed later that day. While speaking to officers outside his dugout, Lieutenant Colonel Loveband was also killed when a bullet struck him through the heart. The war diary records, Germans advancing under cover of enfilade fire in small parties, finally occupied battalion line by 2:30 p.m. Shelling ceased, but rifle and MG fire remained accurate and constant whenever a target presented itself until dusk. In the face of such a breakthrough, it was decided that evening to withdraw to a more defensible line. Exhausted by their staunch defense, the battalion was withdrawn at 9:30 p.m. and bivouacked on the west bank of the canal. Here is a trench map of positions around Shelltrap Farm. Red lines show the trench positions prior to the 24th May gas attack, whilst the blue lines correspond to the final positions after the attack. The image is taken from the 4th Division General Staff Headquarters, May 1915 War Diary. The cost to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. The War Diary records the battalion strength in trenches on the morning of May 24th was 17 officers and 651 other ranks. Such had been the ferocity of the fighting, the shell fire, rifle, and machine gun fire, with the addition of the nighttime chlorine gas attack that, when relieved, only 1 officer and 20 other ranks crossed the canal. What remained of the battalion, reinforced by yet another new draft, moved back to Vlamertinghe Chateau the following day. The entire battalion's strength was only 2 officers and 190 other ranks. Leahy's report concludes with these words: "When the wounded were sent away after dark, there were no Dublins in front of battalion headquarters. From about 2:30 p.m. there was no fighting in our trenches. Everyone held onto them to the last. There was no surrender, no retirement, and no quarter given or accepted. They all died fighting at their posts." Inspecting the shattered remnants of the battalion on May 28th, General Sir William Pulteney, commanding 3rd Corps, commented how sad it was to see so few remaining, and emphasized the fact that the battalion should console itself with the knowledge that those who had gone had done their job. Astonishingly, the battalion, at full strength, 1,027 officers and men, suffered just under 1,500 casualties in one calendar month, from April 24th to May 24th, 1915. This figure clearly includes reinforcements who made up earlier losses. Most of these casualties were sustained during 3 distinct periods in the line. Here are the relevant dates and casualty statistics for the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. St. Julian, April 25th, 7 officers killed, 8 wounded. Other ranks, 45 killed, 80 wounded, 371 missing. Frezenberg, May 9th to May 13th. 4 officers killed, 3 wounded. Other ranks, 37 killed, 60 wounded, 185 missing. 1st Bellewaerde, May 24th, 9 officers killed, 1 wounded, 1 gassed, 1 missing, 1 POW. Other ranks, 14 killed, 35 wounded, 547 missing. And now to the May 24th, 25th battle in general. Although the favorable wind had alerted the British trench garrison to the likelihood of a gas attack, the proximity of the opposing trenches and speed of the enemy assault meant that many defenders failed to don their respirators quickly enough, and large numbers were overcome. But the British defense rallied, and the attackers were repelled by small arms fire. There were exceptions, though. Mousetrap Farm was immediately overrun. In the south, about 1,000 German infantry broke into the British line north and south of Bellewaerde Lake. The center of the line between these gaps held fast all day. Heroic efforts were made to retrieve the situation at Mousetrap Farm before it was decided that evening to withdraw to a more defensible line. The German break-in around Bellewaerde Lake prompted the commitment of Corps Reserve troops, but their arrival took time, and depleted frontline battalions had to wait until the early evening before the weakened 84th Brigade was able to attack and turn the enemy out of Whitport Farm. The 4th Yorks, York and Lancaster Regiment, held the line and blocked further advance in the Bellewaerde Lake area. Following the belated arrival of the 80th Brigade, a joint night counterattack was made after 2300. This assault in bright moonlight was a disaster, and both 84th and 80th Brigades suffered heavy casualties. In the early hours of the morning, the battle quietened. The following day saw a reduction in shelling and no attempts by the Germans to renew the offensive. The lines at the end of the First Battle of Bellewaerde in the Bellewaerde Lake area looked like this. Aftermath and analysis. By the end of the battle, British forces had withdrawn to a new line 3 miles, around 5 kilometers, closer to Ypres, thereby resulting in a compression of its surrounding salient. The city, bombarded by artillery fire, was demolished. Although poison gas had been used on the Eastern Front, it surprised the Allies, and about 7,000 gas casualties were transported in field ambulances and treated in casualty clearing stations. In May and June, 350 British deaths were recorded from gas poisoning. Both sides developed gas weapons and countermeasures, which changed the nature of gas warfare. The French and British used gas at the Battle of Hooge in late September. Gas protection was somewhat improved with the issue of improvised respirators made from cotton waste pads, impregnated with sodium hyposulfate, sodium bicarbonate, and glycerin. The respirators made little difference, however, due to lack of training and the use of local contraptions and poorly made items imported from Britain. The P helmet, or tube helmet, soaked in sodium phenate, was issued by December 1915, and the PH helmet, effective against phosgene, was issued in early 1916. Here's some information about phosgene. Although many French troops ran for their lives, others stood their ground and waited for the cloud to pass. Field Marshal Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, wrote, "I wish to repudiate any idea of attaching the least blame to the French division for this unfortunate incident. After all, the examples of our gallant allies have shown of dogged and tenacious courage in the many trying situations in which they have been placed throughout the course of this campaign. It is quite superfluous for me to dwell on this aspect of the incident, and I would only express my firm conviction that, if any troops in the world had been able to hold their trenches in the face of such a treacherous and altogether unexpected onslaught, the French would have stood firm." The Canadian Division mounted an effective defense, but had 5,975 casualties by its full withdrawal on May 3rd. The division was unprepared for the warfare prevailing on the Western Front, where linear tactics were ineffective against defenders armed with magazine rifles and machine guns. The Canadian field artillery had been effective, but the deficiencies of the Ross rifle worsened tactical difficulties. The Canadian Division received several thousand replacements shortly after the battle. At 2nd Ypres, the smallest tactical unit in the infantry was a company, about 100 men. By 1917, it would be the section, about 10 men. The Canadians were employed offensively later in 1915, but not successfully. The battle was the beginning of a long period of analysis and experiment to improve the effectiveness of Canadian infantry weapons, artillery, and liaison between infantry and artillery. Casualties. After the war, German casualties from April 21st to May 30th were recorded as 34,933 by the official historians of the Rijksarchive. In the British official history, J.E. Edmonds and G.C. Wynne recorded British losses of 59,275 casualties, and the French about 18,000 casualties on April 22nd, and another 3,973 from April 26th to 29th. Canadian casualties from April 22nd to May 3rd were 5,975, of whom 1,000 men were killed. The worst day was April 24th, when 3,058 casualties were suffered during infantry attacks, artillery bombardments, and gas discharges. In 2003, Clayton wrote that thousands of men of the French 87th and 45th Divisions ran from the gas, but the number of casualties was low. The Germans overran both divisions' artillery, but the survivors rallied and held a new line further back. In 2010, Humphreys and Maker, in their translated edition of Der Weltkrieg, recorded that by May 9th there had been more than 35,000 German casualties. There were 59,275 British casualties between April 22nd and May 31st, and very many French casualties, 18,000 on April 22nd alone. In 2012, Sheldon gave similar figures, and in 2014, Greenhalgh wrote that French casualties had been exaggerated by propaganda against German frightfulness, and that in 1998, Oliver Lepic had estimated that 800 to 1,400 men were killed by gas in April out of 2,000 to 3,000 French casualties. Lance Sergeant Elmer Cotton described the effects of chlorine gas. It produces a flooding of the lungs. It is an equivalent death to drowning, only on dry land. The effects are these: a splitting headache and terrific thirst. To drink water is instant death. A knife edge of pain in the lungs, and the coughing up of a greenish froth off the stomach and lungs, ending finally in insensibility and death. The color of the skin from white turns a greenish black and yellow. The tongue protrudes, and the eyes assume a glassy stare. It is a fiendish death to die. Subsequent operations. The first British attack on Bellewaerde was conducted by the 3rd Division of 5th Corps on June 16, 1915, and the second attack on Bellewaerde, a larger operation, was conducted from September 25th to 26th, 1915, by the 3rd Division and the 14th Division of 6th Corps. The Battle of Montsoreau, June 2nd to 13th, 1916, took place south of Ypres with the 20th Division of the 14th Corps and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Canadian Divisions of the Canadian Corps. The Third Battle of Ypres, also known as the Battle of Passchendaele, was fought from July 31st to November 10th, 1917. Commemoration. Canadian participation in the Battle of Gravenstafel is commemorated on the St. Julian Memorial in the village. During the Second Battle of Ypres, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, M.D., of Guelph, wrote "In Flanders Fields" in the voice of those who perished in the war. Published in Punch magazine on December 8, 1915, the poem is still recited on Remembrance Day and Memorial Day. Victoria Cross recipients: Lance Sergeant D.W. Belcher, London Rifle Brigade, Territorial Force, 11th Brigade, 4th Division. Captain E.D. Bellew, 7th Battalion, British Columbia Regiment, 2nd Canadian Brigade, 1st Canadian Division. Jemidar Mir Dast, 55th Rifles, attached to 57th Rifles, Ferozepur Brigade, Lahore Division. Lance Corporal Frederick Fisher, 13th Battalion, Royal Highlanders of Canada, 3rd Canadian Brigade, 1st Canadian Division. Company Sergeant Major F.W. Hall, 8th Battalion, Winnipeg Rifles, 2nd Canadian Brigade, 1st Canadian Division. Private J. Lynn, 2nd Lancaster Fusiliers, 12th Brigade, 4th Division. 2nd Lieutenant W. B. Rhodes Morehouse, 2 Squadron, Royal Flying Corps. Captain F. A. C. Scrimger, Canadian Army Medical Service, 14th Battalion, Royal Montreal Regiment, 1st Canadian Division. Corporal I. Smith, 1st Manchesters, Jullender Brigade, Lahore Division. Private E. Warner, 1st Bedfordshires, 15th Brigade, 5th Division.